The hives had been quiet since the first hard frost. Jakob walked the silent rows alone at dawn. His breath made small white shapes in the air. The old cabin sat dark behind him on the ridge. He had not spoken aloud in 11 days. Then, one cold morning before dawn, he heard it. Jakob stood very still in the doorway of his own cabin. One boot was half off, the other still laced tight to his shin. The breathing came again, softer this time, the kind a wounded thing makes when it is trying not to be heard. He set the boot down without a sound. He crossed the worn pine planks slowly, the way he used to cross the orchard rows. Any wrong step could ruin a season, his wife had always said. The breathing paused, then resumed beneath the floor. He knelt beside the iron stove. The wood sagged from years of weight there. A loose board there had always rattled when the wind came hard. Jakob lifted the board with 2 fingers and laid it gently aside. The crawl space beneath the cabin was a long, low dark. It smelled of dry earth and old wood and something faintly metallic he did not recognize at all. 2 eyes opened in the black. They were pale silver, ringed in a deeper gray, and they did not blink. They only stared at him from the dark space between the joists. He did not flinch. He did not lean back. He simply held the lifted board very still in his old hand. The voice that came up to him was thin as paper. The words were broken, shaped by a mouth not built for his language, and yet he understood them at once. "Please do not tell them I am here." He did not answer right away. He only listened to the small breath beneath. He looked at her, and then at the open door of his cabin. He laid the board carefully back across the gap. She had been there at least 1 night, perhaps 2. The dust on the boards had been disturbed in a small ring around the loose plank. She had tested it many times. Jakob set the kettle on the stove without thinking. He did not yet know what he was going to do. He only knew he was not going to tell anyone. The cabin felt different now, smaller and larger at once. The empty chair by the table caught the morning light. He looked away. The kettle whistled softly. He poured hot water with the dried mint he kept in a clay jar above the sink. The smell rose in a slow green cloud. He thought of his wife then, though he tried not to. She had liked mint tea on cold mornings. She had been gone 4 winters. He carried the cup carefully toward the loose board. He lifted the plank and set the cup near the edge of the dark space where the steam could find her. He did not speak. He did not lower his face to the gap. He simply waited, kneeling with his hands open. After a long time, a small gray hand came up out of the dark and took the cup down with it. Jakob sat back on his heels and let out a breath he had not known he was holding. The light from the kitchen window had shifted while he waited. The morning was older now. Somewhere outside, far off, across the orchard, the metal bell at the trade road clanged once. He flinched. The hand in the dark space froze, the cup half lifted. They listened together for a long, quiet moment. The bell did not ring again. After a long minute, he heard her drink. One careful sip. He thought of how long it had been since she must have tasted something warm. He did not ask her name. He did not ask what she was running from. He only said very quietly that she could stay where she was for now. He laid the board back down and went outside. He spent the rest of that morning doing what he always did. That was the only safe thing left to do. He carried wood from the shed. He swept the front porch. He checked the empty hives with their lids tied down for winter. Anyone watching would see only a widowed beekeeper at his life. That was exactly what he needed them to see. By mid-afternoon, a rider came down the trade road. Jakob saw the dust before he saw the shape of the animal. He went on splitting kindling, the axe rising and falling in the same patient rhythm. He did not look up at the gate. The rider was a coalition scout in gray armor. His helmet was under one arm, his face pale and sharp. Jakob did not lift his eyes until the man was almost at the porch. The scout asked if anything unusual had passed through the orchard in the last 2 nights. Jakob shook his head once. He told the scout the bees were asleep and the road was empty. He said he himself had not slept well, which was true. The scout studied him for a long moment. Then the scout's eyes moved past Jakob to the cabin, to the dark windows, to the thin trail of smoke from the chimney. Jakob did not turn. He kept splitting wood, one steady stroke after another, the way he had split wood the morning his wife was buried, the way he had split wood the morning the orchard nearly froze, The way he had split wood every morning the orchard nearly froze. The way he had split wood every morning since. The scout finally nodded and turned back. When the dust of the road had settled, Jakob carried the kindling inside. He set it down by the stove with hands that were not quite steady. He lifted the loose board a second time. The silver eyes were closer now, just beneath the gap. He could see more of her face, narrow and gray. A fading bruise marked one cheekbone, the color of old iron. He told her, in the simplest words he had, that a man had come and gone. He told her she was still safe. She did not answer at first. Then she said his language back to him in a careful whisper, only one word. Safe. She tried it again, softer. Safe. Jakob nodded, though she could not see him nod. He laid the board down once more. He sat at the kitchen table with the empty cup between his hands. Outside, the sun was already low behind the ridge. The light turned the wood the color of honey. That night he did not light the lamp. He sat by the stove with the door open a crack so the heat could reach the gap in the floor. He ate cold bread and hard cheese and drank water from the well bucket. He listened to the slow shifting of a body learning to rest. He did not weep, but it was close. In the morning he found that she had pushed the empty cup back up through the gap. She had set it neatly on the edge of the plank. She had placed it as one might set a borrowed thing on the table of a kind neighbor. Jakob lifted the cup and looked at it for a long time. Then he washed it and dried it and filled it again with mint tea. For 3 days they lived like that. A man above the floor and a creature beneath it, exchanging small warm things through a loose board between them. He passed down bread, soft cheese, a wedge of winter apple, a folded wool blanket from the chest at the foot of his bed. She passed back the empty cups and one small folded scrap of paper. On the paper was a word in shaky human letters. Thank. He set it on the windowsill. The scrap sat there like a small white flag in a long cold war. He did not move it for many days. The morning light found it every dawn. On the 4th morning, he heard her crying through the boards. It was a strange sound, lower than human, like a disturbed hive. He knelt by the board and asked, in the gentlest voice he had, what hurt? She did not answer for a long time. Then she said, the wound on her side had opened again. Jakob did not stop to think. He went to the chest where his wife's old healer's kit still lay untouched. He brought back and lifted the loose board fully aside, then the 2 boards beside it, until the gap was wide enough for a person to climb up through. He held out his hand into the dark. After a long moment, she took it. Her gray skin was cool against his old palm. He drew her up slowly so as not to tear the wound further. When she stood in his kitchen for the first time, he saw all of her. She was thin and wrapped in a torn dark cloak. Her silver eyes were wide with fear. Her shoulders shook beneath the threadbare fabric of her cloak. She was not much taller than a child of 10. Something in her face said she was older than that, much older perhaps. The bruise along her cheek was only one of many. Her left arm was wrapped in a strip of cloth that had once been pale. The cloth was now dark with blood. Jakob did not stare. He gestured to the chair by the stove. She sat very carefully, the way a person sits when every bone has been holding still for too long. He boiled water and tore strips from a clean linen sheet and laid them on the table. He moved as gently as he could. He showed her the kit, opening each small drawer slowly so she could see what was inside. He pointed at the bandage on her arm and then at his own hands, and then back at her. She watched him for a long time. Then she nodded, just once, and began to unwind the cloth. The motion was practiced, as though she had done this many times alone. The wound beneath was deep and old and badly healed. Jakob worked in silence, cleaning it the way his wife had once taught him. He had cleaned the wounds of orchard cats in his own cut hands by the same lamp. The girl did not flinch, though he could see the muscles of her jaw tighten under the gray skin. When he was finished, he tied the new bandage carefully and sat back. She lifted her eyes to him. She said her name, Vesh. He said her name in return, Jakob. She tried it. She tried it twice before it came right, the soft second syllable difficult for her mouth. He smiled, and it surprised him to feel his face do that. He could not remember the last time. She did not smile back, not yet, but the fear in her eyes had thinned a little. She drew the blanket closer around her shoulders. She looked at the floor where the loose board still lay open. He understood without being told that she did not want to go back down there. He set a second cup on the table, filled it with mint tea, and pushed it gently toward her. Then he tore a heel of bread and laid it on a plate beside the cup. She ate slowly, with the careful dignity of someone who had once known better days. He looked away to give her the privacy. When the meal was done, she pointed at the loose boards and shook her head. Then she pointed at the corner behind the stove. His wife's old quilt hung folded on a bench there. He understood. He moved the quilt and made a small nest of it between the stove and the back wall. No one passing the windows could see her there. She curled there and slept. Jakob sat at the table while she slept and watched the day move across the floor. He thought about the coalition scout and the bell on the trade road. He thought about the way the man had looked at his dark windows. He thought about how long since he had had anything to lose. He thought about the small gray hand that had taken the warm cup. The light moved slowly across the table. The kettle hummed quietly. The wind shifted in the orchard outside. The cabin held its small, warm secret in its old wooden ribs. He did not move until the lamp asked to be lit. The next morning she could stand carefully, and she came to the window. She looked out at the orchard with eyes wide as moons. She had never seen snow before. He could tell by the way she pressed her gray fingertips to the glass. He could tell by the way her breath fogged it. He could tell by the small sound she made when a single flake drifted past the pane. He stood behind her and watched her watch the world. After a long while, she turned to him and pointed at the white outside. She asked with only her face what the word was. He said snow. She said it back, this long and the O careful in her mouth. Snow. She turned again to the window and watched it fall. He showed her the cabin slowly, room by small room, naming things in his language. Stove, table, door, window, bread, cup. She repeated each one in a soft, careful voice. Sometimes she gave him her own word, strange and humming, full of sounds his mouth could not shape. He tried anyway. She did not laugh at him, but the corners of her eyes warmed when he tried. They built the language between them in those first quiet days, half his and half hers. He showed her how to feed the stove. She showed him how to hold her cup, two gray hands around it like a held promise. When the wind came down the ridge and rattled the shutters, she did not flinch. He did not ask her, for a long time, where she had come from. He had been a beekeeper 40 years and knew some things only opened when ready. He kept the loose boards in the floor in case she needed to go back down. She never asked him to put them back tight. They stayed loose all winter, a small door between his floor and her fear. On the 7th night, she told him a little. She said her people had a city of pale spires by a sea that glowed at night. She said she had been one of the keepers of records there, though he did not fully understand. She said the coalition had come for them. She said the records had been burned and the keepers had been hunted, one by one, across the small green worlds. She did not say how she had reached his orchard. She did not say what she had walked through or what had been done to the others. Jakob did not press her at all. He only refilled her cup and added another log to the stove. He sat with her in the quiet until the candle burned low and her silver eyes drifted closed. He carried the empty cup to the sink without a sound. In the morning, he found her standing at the window again, watching a fox. The fox crossed the snow at the far edge of the orchard. She did not turn when he came in. She spoke without looking. She said in her language there was a word for someone who hid the hunted. The word, she said, was almost a prayer. She did not know how to say it. Jakob set the kettle on the stove. He told her the cabin was old but tight. He told her no one came up the ridge in deep snow. She turned and looked at him for a long, careful moment. The silver in her eyes caught the morning light. She said very softly that he did not understand what he offered. She said that if they found her here, they would not only take her, they would take him as well, and the cabin, and the orchard, and the bees. She wanted him to know that. She watched his face for any flicker of fear. She did not find one. The kettle hummed between them. Jakob poured the tea. He set the cup in front of her and sat down at the table across from her. He told her in a voice that surprised him with its steadiness that he had buried his wife 4 winters ago in the orchard. He told her the bees had been quiet ever since. The cabin had been quiet, he said. He himself had been quiet. He told her this was the first warm room he had sat in for a long time. She did not answer for a while. Then she reached across the table and laid her gray hand on top of his, just for a moment. She took it away. The kettle hummed on the stove behind them. The snow kept falling beyond the window. The cabin felt, for the first time in 4 winters, like a place where 2 heartbeats lived instead of 1. He did not say so. He did not need to. She knew. The light agreed. If you are still here with me at this fire, I want to ask you something quiet. If you have ever opened a door at night to someone who had nowhere else to go, leave 1 word in the comments below. Just the 1 word, nothing more. I read each one before I sleep. We still have a long way to walk with Jakob and Vesh in this orchard. The road outside is not done with them, and the worst of the winter is ahead. Take a slow breath with me at the kitchen window. Watch the snow fall a moment longer. Then come back to the fire. The winter deepened around the cabin in the days after that conversation. Snow piled along the porch rail. The trade road below grew quieter as the high passes filled in. Jakob kept his routine unchanged because routine was what neighbors expected and scouts noticed when it broke. He carried wood. He swept the porch. He walked the silent rows of hives in his old gray coat. Inside, Vesh grew stronger. The bruise along her cheek faded into a thin, pale line. The wound on her arm closed at last under a clean white scar. She learned the cabin's small geography until she could move through it in the dark. She learned which floorboards creaked. She learned which window faced the road. She learned the sound of Jakob's boots on the porch. She also learned to hide, faster than any creature should have to learn. When a sled bell rang on the ridge, she was beneath the loose boards before he could turn. When a shadow crossed the far edge of the orchard, she was behind the quilt curtain by the stove. She did not need to be told twice. She had been told once already by a life he could not imagine. He never asked her how she had learned to disappear so quickly. He already knew. In the long evenings, she began to teach him her language in small, careful pieces. She drew shapes in the flour on the table. There were slow, curving lines that she said were the letters of her people's oldest tongue. She said each one had a sound and a meaning at the same time together. She drew the one that meant home. She drew the one that meant fire. She drew the one that meant kept safe. Jakob copied them with a thick, clumsy finger. She did not laugh at the shaky lines he made. She corrected him gently, the way his wife had once corrected the slant of his handwriting. He felt, in those small evenings at the flour-dusted table, that 2 ghosts and a living thing were keeping him company. He did not mind. The cabin was warm. The kettle was full. The wind outside could do what it wanted, because here 3 things were being held by hands that knew how. One night she asked him, in her halting, careful version of his language, about the photograph on the mantel. It showed a woman with a sun-brown face standing among the hives. A wide-brimmed hat shaded her eyes. One hand rested on the painted lid of the tallest hive. Jakob looked at the picture. He looked at it for a long time before he answered. He said her name had been Ada. He said she had loved the bees more than him. Vesh shook her head. She said no woman who stood in the sun like that loved the bees more than the man who took the picture. She said she could tell. She said her people had a word for the way a person stood when seen by someone who loved them. Jakob did not answer. He got up and added a log to the stove. She did not press him. She had a way of letting silences be. She did not feel the need to fill them. He had not known until her how rare that was. His own people, in the years before he met Ada, had always rushed to fill the quiet. They had treated silence as a wound that needed bandaging. Vesh treated silence as a small-held cup. She set it down between them and let it be. He thought, sitting across from her at the flour-dusted table, that he had learned more about quiet from her in 2 weeks than from his own people in 50 years. He did not say so. He only refilled her cup. He added a log. The first true storm came in the 3rd week of her stay. The wind off the ridge howled around the cabin all night. The shutters rattled. The loose board in the kitchen floor whined against the cold. Vesh sat by the stove with the quilt over her shoulders and her silver eyes wide and watchful. She had never heard wind like that before in her life. He told her the cabin had stood through 50 such winters. She believed him. In the morning, the orchard was buried under deep new snow. The hives were small white domes under the drifts. The path to the shed had vanished entirely from sight. Jakob took his shovel and began to dig. That was what a man did after a storm, whether anyone was watching or not. Vesh stood at the kitchen window and watched him work. Her gray hand pressed to the cold glass. Her breath fogged the pane in a small, slow circle around her gray fingertips. He shoveled an hour before he heard the bells, not the small sled bells of a neighbor, the deeper, slower bells of a coalition patrol. He straightened slowly, the shovel still in his hands, and looked down the ridge. 3 riders in gray armor, helmets on, long rifles slung across their backs. They were following the only fresh track on the road, his own from the day before the storm. Jakob did not run. Running was what they wanted from a guilty man. He set the shovel against the porch rail. He took off his gloves, one finger at a time. He walked to the door. He stepped inside and closed it gently behind him. Vesh was already at the loose boards by the stove. She looked up at him with eyes that held no surprise, only the old practiced fear of someone who had done this many times. He knelt beside her and held out his hand. He told her in a voice that did not shake that the boards under the stove were tighter than the ones by the wall. He told her to take the quilt and the cup of tea and the scraps she had been keeping. He told her not to come up until he lifted the boards. She paused at the edge of the dark gap and looked at him. She said his name then, the full careful shape of it from her mouth. She said one of the words she had drawn in the flower, kept safe. She said it like a promise that ran in both directions. Then she lowered herself into the crawl space. He laid the boards down over her and he stood and he turned to the door. The bells were close now. He heard the riders dismount in the yard. He heard the soft crunch of 3 pairs of armored boots on his clean shoveled path toward the cabin porch. He heard the small, dry sound of a rifle being unslung. He took a long, slow breath, the way he had taught himself to breathe when his wife was dying. There had been nothing to do then but stay beside her. He breathed that same breath now. Then he opened the door of the cabin. The lead scout was a tall woman with a scar across her chin. She did not smile. She asked if he was Jakob, the beekeeper of the high orchard. He said yes. She asked if he was alone. He said yes. She asked if he was alone. He said yes. She asked if he had seen a gray-skinned female with silver eyes. He paused only the half-breath of a man considering. Then he said no. The woman studied him for a long moment from behind the white plume of her breath. Then she stepped past him into the cabin without asking. The other 2 followed. Jakob did not protest. Protesting was what guilty men did. He stood in the doorway with his hands loose at his sides. He watched them walk through his small rooms. They opened cupboards. They lifted the lid of the bread chest. They peered behind the quilt curtain by the stove where Vesh had once slept. The scarred woman stopped in the middle of the kitchen. She looked at the floor. Jakob's heart did something slow and heavy in his chest. He did not look at the loose boards. He looked at the photograph on the mantel. He looked at Ada's sun-browned face under her wide-brimmed hat. He held that picture in his mind like a candle in a cold wind. The woman crossed the kitchen. She stopped beside the stove. She bent and laid one armored hand on the floor near the loose boards. Jakob did not breathe. From very far away, he heard the wind move through the empty hives outside. The woman tapped the floor twice with her gloved knuckles. Then she straightened. She told the other 2 the floor sounded solid enough. She said the cabin was clean. She said they were wasting daylight on the ridge. They walked back out past him into the cold afternoon. The scarred woman paused at the door and looked at him one more time without expression. She said, quietly, that if he ever saw the female, he should know she was wanted for crimes against the new order. She said the reward would buy him a better roof. Jakob looked at her with the calm, flat face of a widowed man who had nothing left to want. He nodded once. The scarred woman held his eyes for another long moment. Then she turned and walked down the porch steps and mounted her horse without another word to him. He watched the 3 of them ride down the ridge until the dust of the snow they kicked up settled into the empty road. Only then did he close the door. Only then did he slide the bolt. Only then did he lean against the wood. His hands began to shake finally the way they had not shaken while the patrol stood in his kitchen. He let them shake. He let his knees bend on the floor. He sat down with his back to the door and waited until his breath came even again. The kettle still hummed on the stove. Then he crossed the stove and lifted the loose boards. Vesh looked up at him from the dark. Her silver eyes were wide and bright, with held tears in them. She did not speak. He held out both hands. She took them, and he drew her up. For the first time since the day he unwound the bandage on her arm, he held her. He held her, the way a father holds a child after a near drowning. He did not let go. He did not know how long they stood like that together. Long enough for the shadows on the kitchen floor to shift across the boards. Long enough for the kettle to grow cold on the stove behind them. When she finally stepped back, she pressed her gray forehead against his for a single quiet moment. That was the way her people said the things no words could hold, she told him later. There were no words large enough for what needed to be said. He nodded against her forehead. He understood. The cabin was very quiet around them. Outside, the orchard was very quiet around them. That night, she told him the rest. She said her name in full, the long shape her people used in their oldest songs. She said she was not only a keeper of the records, she was the last of a line of women who had carried the names of their people through 10,000 winters. The records she carried were not on paper. They were in her own mind, written in the curving letters she had drawn in the flower. She said the coalition had not burned her city for the buildings or the harbor or the glowing sea. They had burned it to take the keepers. The keepers were the memory of her people, and a people without memory could be reshaped into anything an empire wanted them to be. She said she was the last keeper alive. She said that if she died here in this cabin, her people would, in time, forget who they had once been together. Jakob listened without interrupting. When she was done, he did not say anything large. He got up and went to the chest at the foot of his bed. He brought back his wife's oldest shawl, the green one Ada had worn through 3 winters of work. He laid it around Besh's shoulders. He smoothed it down with his old hands across her gray collarbones. He told her that as long as the cabin stood, the memory would stand. That was all he said. She did not answer with words. She lifted one gray hand and laid it briefly over his on her shoulder. The lamp guttered low between them. Outside, the orchard creaked under new snow. The bees slept on in their painted hives below the window. The wind had quieted at last. The night settled around them like a held breath. 2 heartbeats moved in the cabin where 4 winters only 1 had moved. The winter went on after that. The patrols came twice more along the trade road. The second time, the scarred woman did not come. Only 3 young scouts came, who barely looked at the floor. The third time, only a single rider, half frozen and too tired to do more than ask for hot water. Jakob gave him the water and watched him ride away into the dusk. He felt for a moment sorry for him. He did not say so to Vesh. She had her own thoughts about the men in gray armor. They were not the thoughts of one who could afford pity for that uniform. She kept herself behind the quilt curtain by the stove until the horse had gone past the second bend below. Then she came out slowly. She poured herself the tea Jakob had set aside. She sat at the table and watched the lamp flame for a long time. Spring came slowly, the way it always did on the ridge. The snow softened, then went gray, then ran in small black streams down the orchard rows. The hives stirred under their winter wraps. Jakob lifted the lids one by one and watched the bees rise into the pale new air above the orchard. Vesh stood at the edge of the orchard, wrapped in Ada's green shawl. She watched them with eyes that held no fear, only wonder. She had never seen a bee. She had never seen an apple tree in early bud. She had never seen an apple tree in early bud. She had never seen the way the sun came back after a long white silence. He stood beside her in the wet grass and named each thing, slow and careful. He named them the way he had in the cabin, as though the orchard were a larger room of the same warm house. She repeated each name. She held it in her mouth like a small, warm cup. She had begun to walk outside in the mornings now, when the road was empty and the air was thin and clear. She walked the rows behind him. She learned the names of the hives because he had given each one a name when Ada was alive. He had never had the heart to stop. Honey Queen, Old Brown, the Wedding Hive. She repeated each name carefully. She said them in her humming language afterward, as though saving them. He understood then, watching her gray lips move around the names of his wife's hives, that she had begun to do for the orchard what she had once done. She had once kept the spires of her drowned city. Now she was making a record of his orchard, hive by hive, name by name. She was saving him the way she had been unable to save her own people. He did not interrupt her. He did not tell her she did not have to. One morning in early spring, she stopped at the far end of the orchard. There, the slope dropped toward the sea of forest below the ridge, and she stood very still. Jakob came up beside her. She said her people would be looking for her again soon, as the snows melted. She said she had heard in the patrol's voices through the floorboards that the search was moving north. She said it would reach the ridge by summer. He did not answer for a long time. He stood beside her with his hands in his coat pockets and watched the wind move across the trees below. He said the orchard had been his wife's home, and his home, and now hers. He said that if the search reached the ridge by summer, they would face the summer together. He said the cabin was tight and the bees were patient. He said no one had ever moved him from the ridge yet. She turned to him in the wet grass. She said, very gently, that she did not want him to die for her memory. She said her people had a saying, a memory carried at the cost of a kind life was no memory worth keeping. She had been thinking through the winter. She said perhaps she should leave when the snows were gone. She would walk into the deeper hills. She would let him return to his quiet on the ridge. Jakob looked at her for a long moment, then he said what he had been carrying since the night she told him she was the last. He said his wife had been a keeper too, in her own small way. She had kept the names of every hive, the temper of every queen, the year of every honey. She had written it all in her tight, neat hand in a book that still sat on the shelf above the stove. He said that when Ada had died, he had not opened that book for 3 winters. He had been afraid that if he read her handwriting, he would forget the sound of her voice. He said that one night in the 4th winter, he had finally opened it. He had read every page by lamplight. He said he had found that the memory of her voice was stronger after the reading, not weaker. He said that this was what memory was for. He said that as long as one kind person was willing to hold a name, the name did not die. He said she was welcome in his cabin. She was welcome not because she was the last keeper of her people. She was welcome because she had drunk the mint tea he passed down through the loose boards. The rest, he said, was a thing they would face together when it came. She did not have to walk alone again. Vesh did not speak. She turned her face into the wind and let it move her dark hair back from her forehead. After a long time, she reached out and took his hand in hers. They walked back together through the wet spring grass between the hives, hand in hand at last. The bees rose around them in slow gold spirals. It was as if the orchard itself had decided to. The light caught on the wet leaves and on the painted lids of the hives. Jakob thought, walking beside her with her hand in his, that he was no longer cold inside the way before. The summer, when it came, did not bring patrols. It brought something else. On a clear morning in the 2nd week of high summer, a deep, slow rumble came from the sky. The engine was larger than any Jakob had ever heard in all his years on the ridge. He came out onto the porch with his coffee cup in his hand and looked up. A ship was descending toward the orchard. It was slow and silver, the size of a small mountain in the blue. It was not a coalition ship. The lines were softer, older, marked with curves. The curving shapes along the underside were the same ones Vesh had drawn in the flower on the kitchen table. Jakob set down his coffee carefully on the porch rail. He turned and looked through the open door. Vesh was standing in the middle of the kitchen with her hand raised. Her hand was pressed to her mouth. Her silver eyes were wide and wet with tears. She told him, in a voice he had never heard before, that the ship was not hunting her. She said her people had a council in exile, far across the dark, searching every small green world. She told him the shape on the underside was the council's mark. She told him she had not dared to hope. She had not dared. Jakob stood on the porch as the ship settled in the long field below the orchard, the grass bending in slow circles around it. A door opened in the silver side and a ramp came down. Figures began to walk out, slowly, as though afraid of frightening something. They were her people, gray-skinned and silver-eyed and tall, dressed in the long pale robes she had once described to him in the dark by the stove on a winter night. He had imagined them many times in the long winter evenings beside the loose boards, but the real ones moved with a quiet that no imagining had prepared him for. The one in front was an old woman, taller than the others, her gray hair bound back in a long single braid. She walked up the slope toward the cabin with her hands open at her sides. When she reached the foot of the porch, she stopped. She looked first at Vesh, then at Jakob, and then she did something Jakob did not understand at first. She knelt. She lowered her braided head to the step. The other gray figures behind her, 12 in all, lowered themselves slowly to one knee in the wet grass. The orchard was very still. The bees moved in their slow gold spirals above the hives. Jakob did not know where to put his hands. He did not know where to put his eyes. He stood very still on the porch and let the moment be what it was. Vesh moved past him then, down the porch, and the old woman lifted her face. The two of them held each other in the strange gray light of the summer morning. They did not speak for a long time. Jakob stood still by the porch rail behind them. He felt that he had wandered by accident into the middle of a story older and larger than he had any right to be in. He looked at his old hands on the wood. He looked at the bees above the hives. When Vesh stepped back from the old woman, she turned and held out her hand to him. Jakob came down the porch steps slowly because his knees were not what they had once been. He took her hand. She introduced him to the old woman in her humming language, slow and careful. Then she introduced him in his, simply, as the beekeeper who had hidden her beneath his floor through one long winter. The old woman looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she bowed her head. She said, in his language, careful and slow, that her people had a word. She said her people had a word for what he had done, and the word had been almost lost to them. She said that as long as her people lived, his name would be spoken at the lighting of every winter fire. She said the orchard would be remembered too. She said the bees would be remembered, and the cabin, and the loose boards, and the floor. Jakob did not know what to say at first. He looked at his boots. He looked at the bees rising in slow gold spirals around the hives behind the cabin in the morning light. He said, finally, that he had only done what his wife would have done. If she had heard the breathing under the floor, she would have lifted the loose board first. He said it had not felt like a great thing at the time. It had only felt like a great thing at the time. It had only felt like the right thing. The old woman smiled at that, a slow, tired smile that made the lines around her silver eyes deepen. She said this was how all great things felt at the time, in the houses of kind people. The ones who knew they were doing great things, she said, were almost never the ones doing them. She said the small, kind things done in quiet rooms were what held the worlds together. She beckoned, and two of her people came up the slope carrying a long folded cloth between them. They unfolded it on the grass at the foot of the porch. It was pale and embroidered along its edges. The embroidery showed the same curving shapes Vesh had drawn in the flower. The old woman said it was the mantle of a guardian of memory. She said it was his now if he would accept it. Jakob looked at the cloth and at Vesh and at the silver ship in the field. He looked at the high blue summer sky above the orchard. He said after a long moment that he was an old beekeeper. He had no use for mantles or ceremonies or great names. He said if her people wanted to honor him, they could simply remember a woman named Ada. He said they could remember the orchard had once been hers, and that she had loved her bees more than she had ever known. The old woman bowed her head again. She said this would be done. She said the name of Ada would be carried as long as the keepers carried any name. She said that in the great hall of the council in exile, when the lamps were lit at the turning of each year, a small lamp would be set aside. It would be lit for a woman in a wide-brimmed hat. Jakob felt his eyes go hot. He turned his face away toward the orchard. He turned so the old woman would not see the wet in his eyes. The bees moved in their slow gold spirals as if they had not noticed the world had just tilted on its quiet axis. He felt Vesh's hand find his again. He held it for a long moment without looking. Vesh did not return to the ship that day. She stayed with him through the high summer. She stayed through the slow gold autumn. She stayed through one more long winter at his hearth. The council came again in the spring, and again the spring after, with books and instruments. They brought small, soft-spoken keepers who sat at the kitchen table and listened. They listened while Vesh poured the long memory of her people back into the world. Jakob made tea for them all. He got the stove burning. He walked the rows of hives in the long blue evenings during their stays. Sometimes, one of the young keepers walked with them through the orchard. He taught them the names of the hives, slow and patient, the way Ada had once taught him. Honey Queen, Old Brown, the Wedding Hive. They wrote the names down in their careful script. They thanked him every time he gave another. He always told them the thanks belonged to a sun-browned woman in a wide-brimmed hat. They always nodded, as if they had heard this before. They had, and as if they would not forget. They would not. The cabin in those years was never empty. The chair across the table was never empty for long. The kettle was never cold for long. The hearth was lit every night now in the small cabin. He grew older the way old beekeepers do, slowly and without much fuss. His hands stiffened, his eyes weakened. The path to the shed seemed longer each winter than the last. But the hearth was lit every night now. The kettle was always full and warm. There was always someone at the table to share the mint tea with him. He was not alone anymore. He had not been alone for a long time. The cabin had not been quiet, and he was glad. On the last clear evening of his last autumn, he sat on the porch with Vesh beside him. They watched the sun go down behind the ridge. The light came pale and gold across the orchard. It turned the painted lids of the hives the color of old honey. He told her he was tired. She took his hand. She said she knew. She said the orchard knew too. She said it was all right. He asked her with the small strength in his voice whether her people would remember the cabin after he was gone. She said they would. The cabin would stand in the long memory. She said it would stand as a small warm room at the edge of a dark winter. It would be remembered as a place where a kind man had opened a loose board in his floor and saved the memory of a world. She said that was enough for anyone's life. He closed his eyes then with the last gold light on his face. He listened to the bees settle into their hives for the night. He thought of Ada in the orchard with her wide-brimmed hat among the flowers. He thought of the small gray hand that had come up out of the dark. He thought of the scar-chinned woman in gray armor choosing not to lift the boards. He thought of the silver ship descending in the high summer light. He thought that he had been, in the end, a very fortunate man. Then he slept. He did not wake again in this life. They buried him beside Ada under the oldest apple tree at the high end of the orchard. Vesh stood at the grave with the green shawl around her shoulders. The council gathered behind her in their long, pale robes. She did not weep loudly. Her people did not weep loudly. Her people did not weep loudly at any grave. But the silver in her eyes was bright as a winter sky over the ridge. The old woman with the braids stood close beside her and held her hand. The bees moved in their slow gold spirals above the hives, as they had on the morning the silver ship had first come down. They moved as they had on the morning Jakob had first heard the breathing beneath his floor. They moved as they would always move, in the small warm orchard at the edge of a quiet ridge above the trade road. The cabin behind them stood with the lamp still burning in its window. If this story has stayed with you all the way to this quiet grave on the ridge, then do something small for me. Tap the like button below so the next traveler who needs a warm room at the edge of a dark winter can find this fire too. It helps the story travel. If you have not yet subscribed to the Hearth, the bell beside the subscribe button will let me bring the next story straight to you. I light a new fire here every week, and I would be glad of your company at it. Subscribing costs nothing, and it keeps the lamp in the window burning. In the comments below, tell me the moment that landed hardest for you tonight. Was it the small gray hand reaching up out of the dark for the warm cup? Was it the loose board the scarred patrol leader chose not to lift? Was it the lamp in the great hall set aside for Ada? Thank you for sitting at this hearth with me tonight. I know there are 1,000 other fires you could have chosen, and I am grateful you chose this one. If the story warmed you, share it with one person you love. Stories like this only travel as far as kind hands carry them. The next story I am writing is about a lighthouse keeper on a sea planet coast. A small wounded thing washes up on his rocks in a storm no one was meant to survive. I hope you will come back when that fire is lit. Until then, be the loose board in someone's floor. Good night, friend.